My pleasure. Good morning, everyone. Um, I'm going to ask Rebecca to move through some slides for us. But I'd like to begin our discussion about civic virtue and what it means to be an American by telling you a quick story about the 19th century when commercial vessels, those large sailing boats, met on the high seas. When they passed each other over megaphones, they would ask three questions of each other. And the first question was, who are you? And the second question was, what is your destination? And the third question was, who is your captain? And these three questions, I think, present a perfect metaphor for us as we think about who we are as individuals, but also as citizens. The question of who are we? The second question of what is your destination presents all of us with a kind of a discrepancy theory about our own lives. We know that we are in a particular place, but we know that this isn't always going to be the place that we will reside in. So we often think about the goals and what the future will bring. And so we're always living in this state of a condition. And we're always confronted with a scientific mind saying that if I do this today, then I can expect that to happen tomorrow. Doesn't always work, but it's in our head. And the third question, who is your captain, translates to me anyway as the question, what do you believe in? What is your discipline? Who is your disciple? And what are the values that you hold? And so with those three questions, let's get into this notion of civic virtue. And we can start with Lincoln, who had great confidence in the people. He said, is there any greater wisdom on earth than the people themselves? But if we go to the second slide, I would like to suggest that Lincoln wasn't sanguine in this belief. I think that he said this, but had in mind that these propositions were all problematic. They're problematic because being a citizen in a democracy or a democratic republic is not in our DNA. It has to be renewed every generation, and it is renewed through education. Not only the education in school, but the education in families, in the community in general. In fact, Pericles, the first citizen of Athens, once said that Athens is a school. You get an education every time you walk down its street. And this begs a question for us: what education do we get and do our children get when they walk down the streets of America? And that's writ large. I mean by that, the media, the television, the conversations, everything that they come into contact with is a school. As a matter of fact, the curriculum of the school may be the third or fourth curriculum, and the curriculum of the church may be the fifth or sixth curriculum. There are all kinds of other things that come before that from which our children learn. So I want to start then with the idea that we are in a unique time. And we could go to the next slide. Every once in a while, a radical break appears in the continuity of time that shakes the foundation of society and its traditional values, declaring those values irrelevant to the vagaries of the present. I am going to make the claim today that we are living in a time between the time. And if we go to the next slide, I want to suggest why this is the case. Minor breaks in time and value orientations are often related to changes in technology or demographics. Major value transformations, however, are breaks that are related to changes in relationships. And our time period through which we are moving, while it is impacted by technology and demographics, I identify its significance as a major break because of the changes in relationships. It's very similar to the time in the beginning of the 16th century, 1500, the high point of the Renaissance. We were just beginning to move into a global age. The Enlightenment was underway, and people were beginning to ask strange questions like, not only is the earth flat, which is sort of a no-brainer, but they were asking questions like, what is my relationship to God? What is my relationship to the earth? What is my relationship to my spouse, my children? And these institutions didn't have the kind of veracity that they needed to remain relevant. And so things began to change. This is also the beginning not only of the global age, but also the age of states, of nation states. And if you think about that a minute and ask the question, what is a family? I know for sure if I'd asked my mother that 50 years ago, hey, Ma, what is a family? She probably would have said in disgust, get away from me. Anybody with half a brain knows what a family is. But we're having trouble with that. What is a school? There are lots of different definitions of that, and this was very clear when I was a student in elementary or high school or even college. What is a church? And even what is a political party, a state, a community? The power of the institutions that we relied on are atrophying. They are simply becoming weaker than they used to be. And this is what happens when you go through a time between the times. So concepts like citizen, and the etymology of that word is particularly important for us to consider. It's related to things like civic, civility, city, civilization, and of course, citizen. And this is a very important thing to consider, because without civility, there's no citizen. Without civic virtue, there's no citizen. And without the citizen, there is no city, and certainly no civilization. This is perfectly clear in any philosophy, any religion, and if you look at history, the perspective there is very clear. So with that context, let's go to the next slide and the question, what is America? What is an American? Which that question is begged from the former. And this is what I believe. I've spent probably the last 5 or 6 years of my time at Minnesota, doing research in the dominant values of America. And there are, of course, 8 of them, which I'll get to in just a minute. But the argument that I'm going to make is that America is an idea. It's simply an idea. We do not have a history of monarchy. There is no dominant religion, language. In order to be an American, you simply have to buy in, and that means have skin in the game of the fundamental premises and principles of democracy, this republic. And the first and most important one is stated in the Federalist Papers. I believe it's numbered 51. And it basically makes the argument that there are 4 branches of government. There's, of course, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, which we learn about in school. But the most important branch is the people. And it's stated very clearly in the preamble, we the people. And if the 4th branch becomes disinterested or corrupt, the other 3 branches will also be. And so this is one of the things that bothers me most about what's going on in the country today, is we have given up what I'll call, or at least laid down, the melancholy burden of citizenship. It seems to be too hard for us. And in doing that, we've also have laid down the melancholy burden of truth. People say we live in a post-truth society or world. Of course, that assumes that the world was always truthful before, which of course is not the case. But the dilemma for us is that a democracy, or a matter of fact, a free market, cannot exist absent truth. So, so here we are, America, an idea. I think we have given up our responsibility. We have placed primary importance, I think, on being selfish rather than understanding what Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, once said, that you need to be concerned with your self-interest, but it needs to be properly understood. And a properly understood self-interest is that you are going to be no better off than the people in your community. And I would want you to live in the best house, to make as much money, and so forth, because the better off you are, the better off I will be. But in order for that to happen, you need to be educated, as I suggested before. And the education that is needed is what Thomas Jefferson suggested when he came back from France and he had seen the Constitution. He was quite upset because most of the ideals in the Declaration were left out. And they were left out because the founders didn't want the unwashed and the ignorant to be in charge of government. Jefferson disagreed. He said, if you think the people are too indiscreet, the solution is not to remove the power from them, but to enhance that indiscretion through education. In other words, send them to school. But the curriculum of that school needed to be special. In other words, you don't go to school to become better off. You go to school to become better, period. In other words, you go to school, you go to church, you attend, you are a member of the family, basically to become a better person. And if you become a better person, the better off will take care of itself. So what are these arguments? Let's go to the next slide. There are 8 values that Americans revere but don't understand much about. There's freedom, equality, unity, diversity, private wealth, commonwealth, or what I would call the infrastructure, both the material and ethical infrastructure. And then there's law and there's ethics. And we talk about and write about these things, but they are meaningless unless you can put them in tension with one another. And this is what one of the most important streams of American history tells us, that the republic survived because Americans, and particularly their leaders, were able to argue these tensions. For example, freedom. We all love freedom, right? Well, but the logical extension of freedom is anarchy. Everybody is free to do whatever they want. That kind of freedom is not democratic freedom. It doesn't belong in a democracy. That notion is in conflict with equality. We want everybody to be equal. Equality is good. The logical extension, however, of equality, it might be communism. It might be a place where everybody is the same, which, by the way, is it contradicts human nature. Nature's God, our God-given abilities. However you slice this, people are not equal. Governments are formed to provide equality, but it always has to be in balance with freedom. Because if you are too free, you destroy equality. If you are too equal, you destroy freedom. And the American citizen knows how to argue that. And so democracy lives in the middle, in the tension between freedom and equality. The next tension, unity and diversity. This is part of our creed, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. Diversity is an interesting thing, but again, if everybody does their own thing within their small group, you identify with the group and you forget that we are part of a nation. And so you need to have certain elements that are held in common. What are these things that are held in common? Well, you know, the belief in the rule of law, the idea that you are responsible for yourself, your family, your community, that there is a reciprocal duty between you and every other citizen. We hold a number of these truths in common. And diversity is a good thing. It enriches the unity. And every family should be encouraged to be as diverse in terms of food, in terms of language, of all the important things that diversity means. But the most important part of diversity is to enhance unity. Most important part of unity is to enhance diversity. And again, there's an argument. How much diversity can we stand? How much unity can we stand? We don't want to be lockstep, nor do we want to be everybody doing, again, their own thing, but calling it diversity is good. It's good to a point. Unity is good to a point. And then there's private wealth and commonwealth. Commonwealth is a concept that was in the minds of the founders, in fact, in the minds of Jefferson. When he wrote the Declaration, he said life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, which was John Locke's words. He didn't like the word property because of slavery and a number of other things, but mostly slavery. It's ironic, but he was an ironic person. So when he changed that phrase, he said life, liberty, and the pursuit of public happiness. And when he brought it back to the committee, I assume it was Ben Franklin that said, come on, Tom, anyone with half a brain knows that the only kind of happiness is public happiness. You really can't be happy by yourself. You can't be happy and selfish. So Commonwealth was something that was understood as public happiness. Virginia was called the Commonwealth. Pennsylvania was called the Commonwealth. Massachusetts was called a Commonwealth. It was part of the way they thought about community. Private wealth is pretty simple. We have a free market. You use that market with the help of, government interactions, because so you don't go crazy, to develop wealth. But wealth here in the argument is not understood as money. It's understood as excellence. What there is private wealth defined as excellent. And so you develop excellence by having a commonwealth, and the commonwealth helps you develop excellence. Better schools, hospitals, roads, whatever you put into the commonwealth helps the private wealth. And of course, the private wealth keeps the commonwealth going. So there's a synergy here that's critical to understand. Those people who don't care much for infrastructure, be it material or moral, must not care much for themselves or the development of excellence either. And all surveys that are done about commonwealth speak to the idea that people are perfectly willing to pay for things if that payment is manifested in an aesthetic environment in which they can live. As a matter of fact, it's pretty interesting when you look at why boards of directors of large corporations move their headquarters to particular cities. The one thing that stands out more than anything, more than taxes, more than schools, is the aesthetic of the community. The community needs to be beautiful. It has to have art, it has to have architecture, it has to have museums, theaters, parks, because people want to live in beauty, because beauty attracts, ugliness repels. And so people in those positions understand that. Put ethics first and almost everything will follow. Then the last thing is law and ethics. And this has always been a terrible and beautiful argument in our history. We've often and almost always have gotten the law wrong, from the law that justified slavery. At the end of the 18th century, the set called We the People was extremely small. It was white men over 21 who owned property. Pretty small. That was the law. That law was in conflict with ethics. And so we set on a march to end slavery, give African Americans the vote, women the vote. And so laws have been changed over our period of time because they were in conflict with ethics. A democracy cannot say anything like, I just follow the law. I'm just here to follow the law. That is a stupid comment in a democracy. Even when you're in service, they teach you that if a commander gives you a command that goes against your fundamental principles and values, you need to question that. Because in the American Air Force or in the American Army, you are not there simply to follow orders. And somewhere along the line, when people say we are a land of law, we are not simply a land of law. We are a land of law and ethics, and those things are in conflict and they must be argued. So what is democracy? What is a democratic citizen? It's a person who understands the tension and the need for argument among these four value tensions. If the arguments stop, if we rule ourselves by things that we might call bumper stickers, or things that are on the news that have no depth to them, these are not arguments. They are platitudes, they are something, but they're not arguments. But I can tell you this from history. Whenever the argument stops, we know what happens. Blood happens. And the citizen that cannot argue these things has laid down the melancholy burden of citizen. And I'd like to finish with the last slide. And this is from one of my favorite poets, Tennyson. And I'll just end it that where he says, "That which we are, an equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will to strive, to seek, to find, but not to yield." And in this period of time, I think it's our responsibility, all of us, not to yield and to try to reinvigorate, as we come out of this time, the fundamental principles of America, which in my mind is a jewel of history. Thank you very much, and I will now be open for any questions.
Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate you're speaking about all these aspects and all the tension that is healthy for a democracy. And I feel like we're in the midst of all those tensions and more right now. In your earlier slide, you mentioned, major weaknesses. And it seems like, to me, I don't know about for you, but it seems to me like we're in the throes of those right now with the, with social media, technology changes that have happened and I think are continuing to happen. And we're all adapting to that. And some, anyway, there's great contributions, and then there's great challenges with all of those. And then I think COVID is another aspect of that, dealing with, I think that's thrown everyone, but then also, the social unrest that we've experienced and the desire for racial justice and anyway, all those things. So.
Yes. Is there a question there?
Well, I'm just whether you see those.
Yeah, I mean,
you talked about two aspects of a major break, but it seems like there's, to me, I see that there's three right now. So it's like, Are we in a super major break or?
I would say that we're in a break that's unique because of the erosion of relationships. And but I think our greatest challenge today, it's a bigger challenge than than COVID, It's a bigger challenge than all the things that are going on in the economy and so forth. I think our greatest challenge today is truth. I think that we have, as I said, laid down what I call a melancholy burden of the pursuit of truth. And I think that's happened, well, for many reasons, but there are two that come to mind immediately. One is the scale of social media. T.S. Eliot, in a wonderful poem called Choruses to the Rock, once said, "Where is the knowledge that we have lost in information? And where is the wisdom that we have lost in knowledge?" And we are confronted with just an avalanche, several avalanches of information. And there's, and we in no way can deal with that. The veracity of truth is so powerful and needed, but the information load is so big, we can't get through it. I think that one of the problems we have is social media and our inability to find knowledge and wisdom in all of that information. And that leads, because people are weak, I believe, not so much weak as lazy, finding the truth is hard work. And we don't want to do that very much. So I think that's number one. Number two is the way we educate ourselves, and particularly our children. Our education is no longer adequate for the time in which we live. And in fact, I think it was more relevant in the 1950s than it is today. I think, for example, that our major universities, like the University of Minnesota, is a glorified vocational school. The children there are there to get a better job. If they learn anything, it's nice, but what they really want is that certification, that license, get out and get a job. If you don't believe it, ask them. And if you don't believe them, ask their parents. University of Minnesota, like Wisconsin and all the others in this country that came after 1863 and before, actually, were land-grant universities. Lincoln signed that Moral Act in 1863. And if you look at the mission of the land-grant colleges, yeah, they were to turn out farmers and miners, but the number one reason for their existence was to create citizens in the Western territories, people who had enough education to govern themselves, and people who could sift through the straw and the chaff and find the nuggets of truth. Universities particularly, but high schools and elementary schools, are in the business of truth finding. They're in the business of thinking about truth as a conditional statement, and we have to find out what is truth. So we develop what Hemingway called a built-in crap detector. We develop a high level of cynicism because we're after the truth, not to be cynical, because cynicism will destroy you, but to have some hope. Yeah, we can find what is true. And if we are true to ourselves, then the policies that we make will be better. For example, at the end of World War II, there was a GI Bill, but it did not include African Americans. They fought in the war, but they were systematically driven out of there. I mean, if we were truthful, we would have said, yeah, they need the Bill of Rights or the GI Bill like everyone else. Another really good example is the policy on segregation in schools. We're going to desegregate our schools because 54, the Brown case said, you got to do it. But the policy for doing it was immoral. And you say, well, why do you say that? Because you don't let your children do what you should do. I mean, if it's good enough for the children, why isn't it good enough for you? If you want an integrated society, let's have open housing. Let's have fair employment. Let's have open voting. I mean, this is the truth, I think. It might be conditional to some extent, but let's stop lying to each other. Let's stop saying that I'm only going to tell what benefits me. So I think the education that our society gives us and our children is second rate. And we are not developing the moral character from our society that we need to be democratic citizens.
There's a lot of questions, Michael.
Okay, let's have them.
Okay. Jackie Prince asks, can you talk a little about the role of civil discourse in argument and how we can restore this?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Restoring civil discourse, you know, how do you bring civility to anything? The simple answer, which is not necessarily simple-minded, but the simple answer is to restore manners. The role of manners in a family, in a school, in a community is the foundation for any moral discussion. If you're not polite, it's okay to teach your children to say thank you. It's okay to say you go first. Manners are paramount to a civil discourse. The other thing that when you get beyond manners, the other thing you have to do is consider the possibility that you might be wrong. And so when you engage in an argument, do it in a story because I think this might be more powerful. When my students were defending their PhD thesis, they had the idea that it was their job to defend their argument. I say, no, that is not your job. Your job is to find holes in your argument. I can find, you know, what's good about your thesis, but I need help from you to find out the truth about what you are doing, what you are thinking. What are the holes in your argument? Please entertain the possibility that you could be wrong. That's a second thing that you have to have. And then the third thing is that it is not enough to advance your own self-interest. You have to, at the same time, advance the self-interest of the community, the interest of the larger group. And again, that is a lesson you learn in Ethics 101. You cannot be ethical alone. I'm sorry, I'm going to start over. Whenever you confront an ethical question, you have to answer it yourself. You can't delegate it. I'm confronted with it. I have to deal with it. On the other hand, you cannot be moral alone. The only way you can be moral is to be in relationship with others, including the earth. You can have a moral relationship with the environment itself. But my relationship with others has to be shot through with a moral principle, which says, my self-interest is tied to yours. I am going to consider that I am wrong in my assertions, and I'm going to be polite. I'm going to show my manners. If we can do those things, we would take a great big step. Now, what is in the way of that? In a word, what is in the way is tribalism. And tribalism is something that almost denies intellectual virtue. It relies on gut feelings. It relies on identity, albeit some identities can be quite dangerous. But tribalism is not consistent with with civil and civic discourse. Tribalism almost always demands lockstep behavior too. And you can see tribalism in Viking fans or Packer fans or whatever. And when you see it, you must recognize it, that we're bigger than this. We're more important than that. And I know your identity comes from being a Viking fan, or some of it does. But if that's all it is, oh boy, you're dealing with a pretty small person.
So can you, somewhat related to this, Jane Thompson asked a question. Can you speak to the issue of our inability to agree on a common set of facts? Is this what you're referring to as truth?
Oh, that's a different kind of issue. The problem is, particularly with social media and that avalanche I talked with you before, people do not have common facts. If you listen to a particular news broadcast or read a particular paper, you're going to be given one set of facts. And if you listen to another, you're going to have another set of facts. If you hang out with this group, it's one thing. If you hang out with another group, it's another thing. There's an illusion that we all have a common set of facts. We don't. And therein is a real problem. It makes it more important for us to consider within our own sense that the facts that I have may be misleading. And so I need to always consider facts as conditional. This is what I think the facts say now, but that's conditional on further investigation. And again, one of the problems we have, it was once a fact that the earth was flat. It was a fact. It was once a fact that in this country that women didn't have the intellectual ability to vote. Oh my God, that was a fact. Or that certain people, because of the color of their skin, which is irrelevant to any notion of biology, were somehow inferior. And people, oh, that must be a fact. No, it's not a fact. It's a condition of your mind that has been warped because you listen to a particular tribal cadence. And it's almost that simple, and it's almost that terrible. And so you should not assume that people are exposed to the same set of facts.
Oh, thank you. I have a couple. Myra Starkenberg asked a couple of questions, but she also had a comment. So I'm going to start with a comment.
Okay.
She said she wanted to mention that medicine has a rule similar to that of the military. She was, as a registered nurse, she was taught not to follow a physician's order if she believed it to be unethical. And she said, fortunately, during her 50-year nursing career, only once did she seriously question a physician's order, and thankfully the situation was quickly and amicably resolved.
Yep.
So, yeah. And
yeah, that has been a problem in all institutions that are devoted too heavily to a hierarchy, particularly a hierarchy that is dominated by men. You find the same thing happening on airlines. The woman sitting, or even the man sitting on the right side, doesn't want to question the captain who's sitting on the left, even though they know he's wrong. And a lot of planes have crashed because of that arrogance. That's what a citizen is, because you are an ethical actor. If you see something wrong, you say that's wrong. I mean, I have a better way of doing that. And you say, well, how far can you carry that? Does it mean that you tell your children when they're wrong and try to explain why? Yeah, you bet you do. Does a teacher tell a student they're wrong? Yeah, you bet. And they tell why. This has to be a condition of any institution where ethics and morality live. If you don't do that, your institution is going to become irrelevant, and worse, it's going to become corrupt. And there are so many institutions that have become corrupt, from the NFL to Catholic Church to the military to Congress. Why is that happening? Because people do not accept their ethical responsibility as an individual, as part of an institution, and I don't know what to say here. Are we that damn lazy that we're willing to throw everything away because we don't have the intestinal fortitude to stand up and say, hey, doctor, that's not the way to do it. And I'll tell you why. Yeah, I think she's absolutely right.